Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking Craig and the VMUG team for bringing me out here, and the global VMUG folks who sort of cover all the bills and things like that. My subject today is From Zero to Colo, which is a bit of a story about my journey in building out my own home lab, which sort of began in the sort of 2003, 2004 period, right up to the current day. I've recently joined VMware August the 8th. I think this is my 25th or 26th week. And prior to joining VMware, I guess people knew me for helping them understand ESX and Virtual Center and SRM and View. My new role at VMware is more to do with the Cloud Suite products, vCloud Director, vCloud Connector, and so on. So I'm sort of trying to get my head around these technologies. My official job title at VMware is Senior Cloud Infrastructure Evangelist. Yeah, so my joke, everybody has a Looney Tune job title when you work for a big American company. The joke I always say is I've not met any junior cloud infrastructure evangelists yet to boss around and make me cups of tea. And the other thing I always say is it's important to understand what evangelism really means. It means staring at people, not into their eyes, but just above their eyes, and saying how everything that VMware does is wonderful and brilliant. So my intention of sort of learning more about the products is I don't think you can be an evangelist or promote a technology without actually using it. Yeah. So that's more or less what this session is going to be about. I want to obviously thank the VMUG leadership already. The other thing I want to just shout out there is if there's any people here who work for a partners with VMware, is going out to see customers, and customers are saying, why should we use VMware to do this when there's a competitor who does X? If you need help and assistance in that sort of competitive kind of play, please come to me for help and assistance. Yeah, I actually work within the competition team, within the Cloud Infrastructure Business Unit. And what I want to try and do is try and be a back channel or a back door to assisting partners with those sorts of competitive kind of queries. I can't offer this service unofficial to customers because there's often, IP around the analysis of other companies and what we do better than them and so on. But it's something I can do with partners. And then lastly, a little bit of self-promotion. Last year, I wrote a book called Building End-User Computing Solutions with VMware View. Yes, it was a snappy, short title, with fellow vExpert Barry Coombs. It's all about VMware View 5.1. But it also covers Thin-Out Factory, Thin-App, Horizon, how to do load balancing across security servers with F5 Big IP, Teradicci, Thin Clients. So it's not just a VMware book. All the royalties from this book get donated to UNICEF. So if you're at all interested in end-using computing and in View, it's a great little tome. It's about 50 pages in length. It's $10 US to download from EUC.book.com, and all the royalties go to UNICEF. So not only do you learn something, you also help a good cause as well. Yeah. Before I begin, I wanted to ask a sort of general question of you in the room about people who have home labs. Out of curiosity, who has a lab at home in which they sort of play around on? Yeah, it's becoming increasingly popular. Can I ask, why is it that you have a home lab? Don't you get enough of IT during the day that you come back and you want more? Are you crazy? What is it that drives people to have a home lab? Why do it? Shout out. Testing? Break and fix? Yeah, doing stuff on your home lab that you can't do in production because it would require a lot of approval. Anything else? Sorry? Well, here's another reason. Career preservation. I think the days of people being sent on expensive training courses by their companies is not coming to an end, but it's becoming increasingly hard to get approval for that. The burden is now on you, the individual, to bring to the business skills and knowledge. Yeah? And if you don't have that skills and knowledge, it's just assumed that you will pick it up in your own good time. Yeah? I worked out this week that actually I've had a home lab of some description since the age of about 21, 22 when I first entered the industry. Back then I was teaching Lotus 1-2-3 and what a mouse was to end users. It was my first ever job out of college. But on the evenings and on the weekends, I'd actually take a PC, a 486 with Windows on it, install other software and learn that to try and learn more about what I was doing to try and get some career progression. And I've kept on doing that for the last 20 odd years, really. The difference is my home lab now really isn't a home lab. You know, once you've got half a dozen PCs, a network, a gigabit switch, and some storage, it really isn't just a single PC in which you install software to. But the principle is the same. Yeah, I drove my career development not by waiting for my employer to decide this is an interesting technology and maybe we should look at it, but by the other way around. I was coming to the business saying we should be looking at this. Yeah, I've used this in my own lab environment and I know how it works. Let me show you what it can do for us. Yeah, a very much bottom up rather than top down approach. Yeah. So maybe the reason, if you didn't put your hand up, that you need to think about this home lab business is career development and career survival. Yeah, making sure your skills don't get depreciated. I don't know whether this particular anecdote I'm going to share with you resonates, but I once worked for a business in the 90s who brought me in specifically for my Windows NT skills on a project they had. The project was about 6 to 9 months, nearly 12, and at the end of that I said to my boss, what do we do now? And he said to me, just stay where you are. Just maintain the environment that we built. And I was like, okay, you know, it's been a lot of change. This needs bedding in. 6 months goes by and I say, what next? And he said, well, we think we're going to keep it just the way it is for the near future. And then I began to realize the longer I stayed with that employer, my skills are going to be gradually eroded by change outside of that business until I wouldn't be able to get a job anywhere else. It was time to leave. It was time to move on to something that was going to drive me further. So maybe that's why you need your home lab, so you can constantly maintain and keep your skills up and running. Because maybe your business isn't interested in cloud right now, but maybe you are. And maybe the business that you'll move to next will look for and expect knowledge of not just the hypervisor and virtual center. If you think you can get a career that's going to last for another 10 or 20 years just knowing a hypervisor and just using virtual center, you need to think again. These skills are becoming increasingly commoditized. And once everybody knows what you know, what value then is in that knowledge? Less than it was before. Yeah? So maybe this is a bit of a warning across the bows. Yeah? So I want to talk about my kind of journey, how my home lab developed. But I also want to speak more specifically about how looking at vCloud Director and our cloud layer has changed the way I've been thinking about the way my vSphere environment should be set up. I'll try and keep this early part, which is quite humorous, but not really the main topic, short and snappy if I can. Yeah? So before I go any further, I just want to make sure I make some references to vCloud Director, and then it occurred to me this week that maybe some people don't know what this is. But it's essentially a layer of abstraction that gets put above the virtualization layer, yeah, such that people can deploy and create complicated VApps without having to understand the underlying plumbing, as some of my American chums like to call it. So you don't have to know what a cluster is or what a distributed virtual switch is or what port groups are. They just deploy and create VMs. Yeah? It has a number of constructs that are quite important to understand. The provider VDC is basically a container that allows you to add many clusters now in version 5.1. So when somebody says, I want a resource, they don't really need to see what the clusters are. Yeah? You kind of put a layer above that. An organization virtual data center is what's created for a tenant in the cloud. So in my own work that I've been writing, I've created a fictitious company called corp.com, which has 4 companies in it. It's just a holding company, and each one of those are tenants in my cloud. Yeah? They log into their organization, they see their virtual data center, but they have no idea of the underlying physical or virtual resources. I abstract and hide that away from them. Yeah? There's obviously some networking that goes on as well. So you do have these things called org networks and external network. An external network would take you to the internet or to the corporate backbone. The organization network is their own sort of domain that they can manage. And you can either link these things together or not have them linked together. It's entirely up to you. And rather than having, every time I want a new network, having to go to the physical switch and define a VLAN, you can create pools of networking either on VLANs or on LAN, a new feature in vSphere 5.1, or using what's called vCloud Director Network Isolation Pools. So there's different ways of sort of creating bundles of networks that can be easily deployed to. You don't really need to know any of this, but rather than just assuming that people know what vCloud Director is, I thought I should have at least one slide that says this is what it roughly does. Yeah. So long, long ago in a galaxy far away called 2003, this was my first attempt to install ESX2, and I tried to install it to a Dell Optiplex PC sat under my desk and didn't get anywhere at all. The only IDE controllers that ESX2 recognized were ones that you would find inside a blade enclosure, because the early blades did boot from IDE. Impact on my girlfriend, nil, because we didn't live together, and a PC doesn't make that much noise. Yeah? I then moved on and made a second attempt. I went to my OEM provider of choice called eBay, yeah? One of the largest server providers on the planet, and I bought off eBay two Dell 1650 Pentium 3 processor systems to put ESX2 on. And I also bought a DEC Alpha JBOD. And yes, I bought the external SCSI cables to plug two separate servers into the same JBOD, and I have done vMotion on Pentium 3 processors with a JBOD as its back-end storage. Yeah. Girlfriend impact, limited because we still weren't living together. Yeah. But this kit did make a bit of noise. So when she used to come round and I was getting a bit romantic, I would obviously shut this off before she came round, because nothing's more than a passion killer than woo in the background while you're trying to be romantic. Yeah. So, but the impact was relatively minimal. Then came along the sort of VI3 era, and I was doing quite well with my VMware instructing. That's what I used to do as a freelance instructor. And I bought four HP DL385s, the AMD processor types. They were factory spec'd, factory sealed, yeah, but they were on eBay. So I didn't ask too many questions about where these things had come from, yeah, because usually it's something that's been de-racked that's on eBay, yeah. And I went down to Frimley in the UK, and from a former VMware employee called Richard Garsagan, I bought off him a Sun Storage fiber channel array. In fact, it's really just a JBOD. Yeah, it has no intelligence, no RAID levels, no replication at all. On top of that, I actually put the left-hand VSA, virtual storage appliance, two of them replicating to each other. And on the back of this equipment, I wrote the very first SRM 1.0 book. Yeah? So dumb, stupid, unintelligent disk. Where all the intelligence was in the software in a virtual storage appliance. Doesn't that sound suspiciously like software-defined storage to you? Yeah? So I now jokingly say, I was doing software-defined storage back in 2007, yeah, before even VMware or anybody had invented this term. Yeah? I'm joking, of course. Impact on the girlfriend, pretty poor. The reason being is at this point we'd actually moved in together, and all this was in our basement. Yeah, so I'm heating our basement, always a good use of electricity. Yeah, you know, drying out your basement with the temperature of servers. And when she went out to work in the morning, I would go down in the basement and power all this stuff up. Usually take me about an hour to make it all work, you know, making sure I didn't switch on the storage too quickly, waited for it to bimble down before I start powered on my servers. And then when she came back in the evening, I'd log out and shut things down and power it all out again. Yeah? But when she got to the door and the neighbors could hear all this like kit, woo! Yeah? 4 servers in an array, and a gigabit switch, of course. Yeah? So, that's how far I got with the VI3. Then came the vSphere 4 era, and I was at VMworld, and I was sat at a dinner table with a guy called Chad on one side and a guy called Vaughn on the other side of me. That turned out to be Chad Sackage from EMC, one of the VPs, and Vaughn Stewart, NetApp's chief VMware Alliance partner. And I rather foolishly said, I have a problem with storage. I don't have enough of it, and it's all unintelligent. Yeah? And after a while, both of those guys sent me 2 NS20s for about 14 U worth of, you know, kit, and Vaughn sent me 2 NetApp 2020s, which is 2 GU boxes. And at this point, I realized that trying to cram all this into my basement really wasn't going to work out. So I moved to a co-location, which was relatively reasonable, although pretty poor. And impact on girlfriend, well, the noise had gone away, but now she was complaining about how much it cost us to fund this colo. And I used to say to her, well, it's me who pays the Colo bills out of my business. It's not coming out of our joint account. But, you know, she used to say, you know, the money you put in the Colo, we could go on holiday. I used to say, well, it's not like we're really poor. You know, we still have the Colo and go on holiday, you know, but it didn't go down very well. Yeah. So the next thing that came along, I got some more kits. I left the Colo, I came back to a Colo, and this is where I am now. Quite a lot of equipment, 42U rack. I've got 2 Dell Ecologics arrays, because Dell gave me 2. I sent back the EMC arrays to free up some space so I can put some more servers in. Yeah. But it is costing me an arm and a leg to sort of run this particular infrastructure, although it is in a much better facility. Impact and girlfriend, we're getting married. Yeah. On May the 4th of this year. Thank you. But I don't think it's because the Colo has any impact on this. And yeah, May the 4th be with you. Yeah, I mean, I did try to ask, you know, why can't we have stormtroopers instead of bridesmaids? Yeah, and what is wrong when you walk into to get married that we can't have So I just couldn't get that buyer, sadly. So we're having the regular bridesmaids and, you know, all the other bits. But the reason I want to tell you this is that I now have to look at this equipment in a different way than I have in the past. Yeah. Because the way this kit was used in the past for my SRM and vSphere stuff now needs partitioning and organizing in a way that I never really thought about in the past. So I know it probably sounds a bit tedious for this guy to be standing up here going, oh, then I had this bit of equipment and then I had this bit of equipment. But I wanted to show you where I got to. This isn't a home lab. Yeah. This is a second mortgage. Yeah. And although I have sponsors on my website, it doesn't cover all the cost of this. So increasingly, I'm looking at this and thinking, this is an expensive deal to do what I need to do. Is there not a more cost-effective way of doing this? Because this equipment is almost like industry grade, although a lot of it is now ready for the skip. Yeah, the AMD process, they're G1 HP boxes. You know, they should have gone to the skip in 2007. Yeah. But the interesting thing about this and this journey I've been through in terms of a home lab is when I looked for a server on eBay back in 2003, you couldn't find them for love nor money. And what was there was quite expensive. You go on eBay now and just search for a HP server, you'll find pallets of the stuff. Racks and racks and racks of it. I see that as a kind of unquantitative measure of the power of virtualization. It's virtualization that's causing people to put pallets worth of equipment and say we don't need this anymore. Yeah? Although I don't think you can really make a quantitative judgment on that. So my former vSphere setup was very much geared around the work I was doing at SRM. I had 2 virtual centers, one for New York, one for New Jersey. I had the SQL backends for those. And my data stores were very much laid out for, this is the data store for the CRM application. This is the data store for my mail. This is the data store for my view environment. And I'm going to replicate those LUNs at different rates and different procedures and things like it. Rather than using the PowerPoint slides to the bullet list here, I've got some screen grabs. Yeah, so this is my old lab environment, my old vSphere environment. So 2 locations, and in SRM I was mapping VLAN 11 to VLAN 51. So when a virtual machine was failed over to the other side, it would come up on the right network at the destination. That kind of thing. Yeah. And same with my clusters and resource pools. Yeah, when VMs were failed over and failed back, they were failed back into and failed over into a resource pool structure. It was very much geared around SRM because that was I had my SRM hat on, not my cloud hat on. Yeah, all of this I decided I needed to rethink and change in the last 6 months. Yeah, so I'm now in a new era. You could call it the cloud suite era or the software-defined data center era. So you know, what am I doing now? First decision in this particular lab was the decision to use appliances wherever possible. Because I know before I even joined VMware, the message is about appliances, appliances, appliances. Yeah, OVFs and OVAs you download and deploy. The days of people actually installing bits of software inside a VM for infrastructure components is something we're all trying to get away from. So I do use the Virtual Center server appliance. One of the big reasons for doing that is I now know that the APIs for the Linux version of Virtual Center are exactly the same as the APIs that I use on the Windows version. There is no functional difference between the two. Yeah? With that said, the Linux version doesn't support link mode, which is significant for anybody working in a multi-virtual center environment. Doesn't yet support the sharing of roles or the sharing of license data from one virtual center to another. So there isn't exact feature parity on some of those components. So hands up, in production environments, I would have thought most of you are actually using the Windows version of Virtual Center. Stick your hands up if you're using the Windows version. Yeah? So, but this is a home lab, and I didn't really have to worry too much about those sorts of restrictions. Yeah? If you are going to go down this route, either in production or in lab, one thing I'd warn you about is plugin support. Yeah? The Linux version of the Virtual Center is quite new, and if you're a big fan of NetApp's Virtual Storage Console or EMC's Virtual Storage Integration, yeah, those tools are very often based on Windows and often require a Windows instance to install, and very often the plugin only works with the vSphere C# client as opposed to the new web client. Yeah? I really love these plugins, but I don't use them enough for me to decide that I had to use the Windows version. By using the virtual appliance, I reduced my Virtual Center footprint by a factor of 1. I don't need a Windows instance or a SQL instance anymore, I just have the appliance. I'm using the built-in Postgres database embedded into the appliance to do the DB backend. I also decided to use the vCloud Director virtual appliance as well. Who here has actually tried installing the vCloud Director software into Red Hat Linux? Stick your hand up if you've done that installation. Would you regard that as an easy walk in the park kind of install and setup routine? If you're a good Linux person, it's probably relatively easy, but if you're a Windows guy and Linux is not familiar territory, it's a bit of a ask. So I went down on the appliance because, you know, I just wanted vCloud Director. I didn't want to waste time installing the software. One thing I would say about this appliance is it's demo only, test only, lab only, training purposes only. It has no support in a production environment. It does not support yet a multi-cell configuration. Now, personally, I hate this word cell in vCloud Director. I wish they just said server. Yeah? All they mean is you can have more than one vCloud server and do load balancing across those. And if that load balancer is intelligent enough, it will not direct somebody to a node which is down. Yeah? To do that, you need to actually install the product. I do intend at some stage to actually scrap this appliance and do the install and have a multi-cell environment with load balancing, just so I get my hands on and I practice. Yeah? But my long-term hope is that I never have to do the install, I just use the appliance. Yeah? I had to use vShield, it's only appliance only, and for fun I decided to include the vSphere replication appliance and also data protection appliance. I'm a big advocate of the fact that I think cloud, just generally, must offer DR to tenants in the cloud and must offer tenants the ability to back up and restore their data. That's something that we're all working towards. Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but I wanted to have these appliances in place so as I did upgrades, new functionality and new features would be exposed to the vCloud layer. Yeah. The other thing that I realized as I started to make these particular changes is how commonly we create silos or virtual silos in the vSphere infrastructure. If you like, my New York and New Jersey were two different silos. I pretended they were in two different parts of the US, even though they're all in the same rack in the UK. Yeah? I used to use UK locations, but because most of my audience is from the US, they didn't know where Reading was in the UK. So they knew where London was, but everything else is a bit of a mystery. And they were separate domains. The cluster here, the cluster there, it saw only the VLANs for that site, the storage for that site. But what I did in the end was collapse that. So I only had two clusters, all managed by one virtual center, New York, with New York having gold and silver in. But then I started to ask myself the question, should the gold cluster be able to see the same storage as the silver cluster and vice versa? Should the gold cluster be able to see the resources, or the silver cluster be able to see the networks of the gold cluster? So one of the things that troubles me a little bit is the way we do silo things out. Does anybody here have two clusters, but then a single LUN that both clusters can see to aid in the movement of virtual machines from one cluster to another. Does anybody do that here at all? Stick your hand up if you do. Sometimes referred to as a swing LUN, as a method of moving VMs from one cluster to another, because without that shared storage, the VMs are kind of locked in that cluster, aren't they? Yeah? Okay, well, let's think about that. In vCloud Director 5.1, the provider VDC can now contain multiple clusters. So question one, how does it decide when you create a new VM which cluster to put that virtual machine on? And if a particular cluster becomes hot compared to another cluster which is cooler, what processes are there to facilitate the movement of VMs from one cluster to another? Yeah? So I'm thinking, if I don't show the storage and I don't show the networking, there's no way that a VM could ever move from one cluster to another. That's why you have your swing LUN, to facilitate that process. I don't know what the real answer is to these questions I'm posing. I'm still troubled with them already, yeah? Because change, when software changes, it starts to challenge your assumptions and best practices. But I thought, isn't it curious that we, in the vanguard of virtualization, have decided to partition the environment from one cluster, which can see one set of networks and storage, and another cluster that can see one storage and one set of networks. Why do we create these silos with VMware clusters? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm looking for an answer. Why do we do this? Why do we separate them out? What reasons? Yeah, because, you know, whatever I do in this particular silo, it can't affect this silo. Yeah, and it reduces the complexity than having all these interlinked things in. Yeah, any other reasons? Pardon? Yeah, there may be scalability limits, because not so long ago, in a linked mode environment in VMware View, you could only have 8 servers in the cluster. That's since gone away with the new release. You can have up to 32 because of the changes in VMFS and in NFS. But there were scalability limits and things like it, not least the number of paths you might have or the number of LUNs you can display and things like it. Any other reasons? Dev and test. So separate domains, yeah, for different things. You could include PCI domains. If you're doing any credit card transactions, maybe you want to have that separated off. Isn't it interesting that we've used physical ways of creating this separation? In this era of virtualization, I'll take you in a second, in this era of virtualization and the software-defined data center, isn't it curious how we're using a hardware data center construct as a way of getting those separations? Shouldn't we be using soft controls to get that kind of separation? I mean, for example, if it is PCI security, you could be using vShield app as a way of creating a boundary around a bunch of virtual machines and saying that's my PCI domain. If I've got test and dev systems, I could put them on different clusters, or I could use resource pools to keep them separate. It's interesting how even in our community, we still use hardware-based methods to get that kind of separation. Yeah? After all, your VMs are quite happy to share the CPUs and share the memory of a bunch of hosts. But when it comes to networking and storage, well, actually, we don't share them. We keep them separate. Yeah? I don't know the answer to these questions I'm posing, but they're precisely the kind of ones that you need to start asking yourself. Our industry needs to start asking and questioning whether we want to persist in this particular way of doing things. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I still, when I'm looking at this, go, have I done this right? Are the best practices that we used to recommend in vCloud Director 1.5 still relevant in 5.1? Or are they up for grabs and up for questioning? I stopped you from contributing, but I guess you had an example. Yeah, contention. I mean, you know, both of my clusters, gold and silver, can see the same storage. But what if a tenant in silver creates a lot of IOPS on a shared volume that somebody in gold is using? Yeah? Kind of makes me nervous. But then I kind of don't want to create silos and create boundaries at the same time. Yeah? So let me tell you what I ended up doing. The compute side of things, like I said, one virtual center called New York, yeah, with gold with 4, or now 5, AMD boxes and 4 Intel boxes. Actually separating the compute was very easy. I had a generation of Intel and a generation of AMD. Can you put AMD processors and Intel processors in the same DRS cluster? Is that a wise thing to do? Not really. Because even with the wonderful power which is EBC, Enhanced vMotion Compatibility, an AMD processor, if it gets an Intel instruction, what do you think it's going to do with that? It's just going to go, what? Have a panic attack. Yeah? So what was interesting about this for me, from just thinking about it, is this partitioning of compute, CPU and memory, into different clusters. How often will you have no choice about doing that? Well, you may be forced to create separate clusters, whether you like it or not, because of different generations of hardware. Yeah? It is not a good idea to have a single DRS cluster with 8 ESX hosts with 32 gig of memory and the other 8 with 64 gigabytes of memory. The assumption in DRS is your servers are all identical from both a CPU and a memory perspective. As soon as you blend them all together, even with enhanced vMotion compatibility, what if there's memory differences? My silver cluster only has 12 gig of RAM on each box. The gold cluster only has 16 gigabytes. So even if the processor types were the same, I'd be introducing 2 different types of server that had different memory profiles. Not a very good idea. Yeah. So I ended up with one site, 2 clusters. You might also notice that there's a resource pool here called infrastructure. That's where I put my VC, my vCloud Director appliance, and some other bits and bobs, my domain controller. Yes, I'm actually running the thing that manages the thing on the thing that gives the resources out. This is not a very smart move, but if you work in a home lab, you'll end up having to do this because you don't have enough resources to create a dedicated management cluster, as it's sometimes called. In a larger enterprise environment, you'd probably be able to do that, but in SMB or in a test and dev environment or in a home lab, you're going to have to run your management stuff on the very thing that is divvying out resources. And of course, my worry is if I do something wrong in vCloud Director and say I want 1 million VMs, does the whole thing collapse and I lose all management of it because the management infrastructure is on the same thing? And what dictated the difference of the clusters was really the CPU types. Yeah. Storage. This is an interesting one. I ended up creating 4 tiers of storage, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. You'll find this funny. I initially started off with about 17 tiers of storage, yeah, where every tier got a gradually longer and longer replication cycle. So this tier 1, replicated every 5 minutes, half an hour, 2 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. And I got to the end of this process. I was just doing this on paper, thank God. I started thinking, hang on, this whole cloudy thing is meant to be a consumption model where customers come in and say, I want a VM and I want it on this bit of storage. If I give them 17 different choices of what type of storage they can have, that's not really simplifying the environment, is it? Agreed? The way I looked at it as an analogy is it's a bit like you buying a new mobile phone and moving to a different comms provider. Who's here recently switched to a different mobile comms provider here at all? New phone, one guy here, he bought a SIM card. Any? No? Okay. Well, you know when you go and look at the packages that they have, the salesman says, oh, we've got a very simple model for the different data plans. It's on this card. Yeah? With all the different dicing and slicing that they do, almost to make it impossible for you to compare it to another provider, yeah, because they don't have exactly matchups and prices and what they provide. So I had to scrap this 17 levels of hell, circles of hell that they would have to choose from and try and go for something a little bit more simpler. I don't know whether this is too simple, yeah. So I destroyed all my data stores, yeah. That's an option in production, isn't it? Yeah. But in a lab environment, you can get away with it. Imagine that you're about to embark on a vCloud deployment, in your enterprise, and you say to your manager, the first thing I need to do is wipe all of our data. That's not really going to go down very well, but in a lab environment, I could do that. So the only thing that I retained from the previous configuration was an infrastructure data store where the domain controllers and all the other bits were, my templates and my ISOs. The rest I just got rid of. And I created my 4 tiers. So Platinum, tier 1, is on my NetApps, fiber channel, with SnapMirror, SaaS-based replication every 5 minutes. It's the highest quality. Yeah. Gold, or tier 2, Dell, iSCSI. Yeah. SAS replication every hour. The only reason that the Dell got put lower than the NetApp is the Dell, I've only got 1 gig interfaces to that storage, whereas the SC is in part either 2 gig or 4 gig. That was the only real differentiator. So I don't prefer NetApp to Dell or anything like that. And then Silver, NetApp, NFS, and SATA. What I did with that is I actually used the new feature in vSphere 5, the datastore cluster, where you can take a series of volumes and then make it appear as if it's one datastore. Why did I do that? Well, I was chatting to my good friend Cormac Hogan, some of you might know, Irish guy, bit of a ponytail, storage dude, used to work at EMC. And he told me something I didn't know about the NetApps, which is when you create a volume on a NetApp filer, I assumed that the IOPS would be on every spindle within a particular aggregate or RAID group, as some people call it. What I was surprised to hear was that isn't actually the case. It may actually only be on a number of disks, not all of them. So I said to Cormac, I said, if I create 300 gig volumes, does that mean one could be hot and one could be cold in terms of the IOPS? And he said, yes. So one way around that is to use datastore clusters and storage vMotion. If one of the 300 gig volumes gets hot, it'll just get moved to a different volume, which would be on different spindles. With the Dells, he said to me that when you create a volume, it writes across all the spindles in the RAID group, so you don't have to worry about it. So isn't that interesting that the way storage is addressed then changed the way I actually use the feature at the virtualization level to optimize the best usage of it? Nothing to do with cloud, and everything to do with the vSphere layer and the physical layer, and how I was going to present the storage up. The other interesting thing about this is I obviously have less SAS-based storage than I have SATA-based storage. So the two SAS-based NetApps and Dells had about 2 terabytes on them, but the SATA-based ones had at least 8 terabytes or 12 terabytes. So once I'd completely replicated everything from a SAS-based array to its partner SATA array, I was left with space left over that I couldn't use, except by another layer of storage. And it occurred to me that Silver was based on NetApp and Bronze was based on Dell. There was no native replication at an array level that could be had between these two. Isn't that a wonderful opportunity or illustration of using vSphere replication? Because the great thing about vSphere replication is its capacity to replicate at a VM level, regardless of what the storage layer is. It's so high in the stack, the virtualization stack, it really doesn't give a damn whether it's local, iSCSI, NFS, or fiber channel, NetApp, doesn't care. So I thought, well, I could offer another layer, if you like, of protection, which is based on host-based replication or vSphere replication, and it'd be a better utilization of the storage. So I did have some storage anxieties. I've got multiple organization tenants sharing the same data store. And my other worry was, what about Site Recovery Manager? If I've got multiple tenants sharing the same storage, and then I run SRM and I fail over VMs from that storage, I affect multiple tenants. Not just one BU, not just one application, but all of my tenants sharing the same storage. That occasionally has made me think, well, maybe what I should have is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 for this tenant, and then another set of volumes, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, for this tenant, and another set of volumes for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 for this tenant. What do you think of that as an idea? Every tenant gets their own allocation of tiered storage. 4 times 4 would have been 16 LUNs in my particular case. I've got 4 organizations. But what if I was supporting 20, 30, 40? Exponentially, every tenant I onboard into my cloud increases the number of volumes I have to manage and monitor by a factor of 4. And I'm trying to get it simple. I'm not trying to get it complicated. This is another siloing question, really, isn't it, in disguise? Should tenants be able to see and have access to volumes that other tenants are using? Or should they be siloed off and only be able to see LUNs that are dedicated to them? How expensive does that become on enterprise storage? I'm trying to drive down the cost per VM, but I'm doing it in a way that's very expensive if I approach it that way. There are some solutions, I think, to these anxieties, especially around SRM. Not least, VR allows me to protect individual VMs and fail over individual VMs. So if I've got 5 or 4 organizations sharing the same storage and everything is replicated with VR, when one of those orgs decides to do a failover test, it's just their VMs that move and nobody else's. Yeah. Another solution, I think, to this particular problem would be VMware vVols. Yeah. The idea that at the array level, every VM and every VMDK gets its own virtual volume with its own replication cycle, as if it was on its own LUN, yeah, without the pain of having to create a LUN for every VM that you have, which would be obviously a little bit silly and not scale very well. The trouble with this idea about vVols is that's not what we have on the truck right now. That's something that's coming in the future, and I like to deal with the problems that we have right now rather than saying all of our problems will go away in the future. Yeah, it's quite typical at VMware that we do like to talk about futures, but we mainly focus on what we've got currently. We leave talking years and years about products that are going to come during beta programs to our competitors. Yeah, without naming any names, I'm sure you know who I mean. Yeah, but anyway. So from the network side of things, this was a little bit easier. I created 2 distributed virtual switches, one for my infrastructure, which carries all the traffic that allows my vSphere layer to work, and a totally separate distributed virtual switch plugged into a totally different physical switch with a bunch of VLANs to use. The main reason I did this is that I didn't want one single switch managing the whole thing, for fear that if I did something stupid, and that's something that usually happens on a weekly basis, that if I changed something about one DBS switch, that it could affect all my tenants. Also, I didn't want a situation where I did something at vCloud Director and then it had unforeseen consequences and it blatted my management of that system. The Colo where I'm at is nearly 20 to 30 minutes to drive to, yeah, which isn't that far away, but it's an hour round trip. And I don't want to be particularly having to go there just to try and fix networking problems that I've created myself by screwing up the network. Yeah. I did in the end get rid of standard switches. Yeah, vSphere 5.1 has a lot of protections now to stop you from damaging or destroying your connections to the actual infrastructure. So when you make changes in the DBS switch now, it actually works out whether any disconnects could take place to your virtual center or your ESX host. And if that answer is true, it rollbacks your management change. Yeah, so it actually stops the administrator from doing something stupid. Yeah. Or as I like to call it, it stops you sitting on a tree, branch of a tree, with a big saw and slicing through the very tree that your branch is sat on, yeah? Yeah, it protects you from that kind of stupid admin sort of stuff, yeah? This approach of switching to DBS has already paid dividends straight away. When you're learning a new technology, you don't know all the prerequisites all the time. And yes, you can read the prerequisites in PDF, but they don't always tell you the tiny, tiny other prerequisites. Yeah? One of the things I forgot in vCloud Director is a vCloud Director server has 2 network interfaces, one for the HTTP traffic and one to create a window on the virtual machine. Yeah? And I didn't have in my DB switch, in my switch configuration, a port group for that particular traffic. It took me 2 seconds to put it on the DBS switch. If it had been standard switches with 8 hosts or 9 hosts, I'd be reaching for my Power CLI to try and put a port group on every single ESX host and do it in a kind of ripple effect across the cluster. Yeah? So it made it much simpler. My networking anxieties, you know, what if I did fat finger syndrome? The fact that both clusters could see all the VLANs of both clusters. So it's the same siloing kind of effect that I was worried about. And the other thing I was kind of concerned about was some of the best practices around this sort of stuff, because if you read the best practices around vCloud Director 1.5, it's very much siloed. But if you look at the technology of vCloud Director 5.1, you can see this kind of drifting of saying, well, do you really need to create these silos? Yeah. So it's still this sort of silo thing that I was kind of worried about. And I've gone for a very flexible, both clusters could see everything approach, because I think that's the direction it's going in. But it did make me think about best practices, yeah, in our industry, yeah. So this is a sort of side note, if you like. Do best practices come about by certain operational tasks being forged in the white heat of production environments in a kind of Darwinism evolutionary approach that over time this best practice kind of grows out of the protozoic slime and becomes this sort of truth? Or do best practices come out of beta programs where a bug is found in the software or a limitation is found in the software. So the ISV then writes a best practice around that to stop customers configuring something that could burn them. Yeah. Do best practices come about and become established because of a limitation in the technology? A provider VDC can only see one cluster in vCloud Director 1.5, but a provider VDC in 5.1 can see many clusters. So how often is it limitations in the technology that dictate what those best practices are? Well, which one do you think it is? Is it the Proterozoic sign, evolved over time, forged in the white heat of the real world, or is it the other two? It's the other two, really, isn't it? Although I would say there's a certain amount of best practices that do come out of the community, do come out of PSO, and that eventually works it in. Some of the best practices are actually based around what the software is capable or not capable of doing. So there's a message here, and it's kind of linked to the silo thing. Yeah. A couple of years ago, the silo approach was probably the thing that was best practice, but I actually think that is up for grabs. There's a question mark over it. Be wary of basing your best practices. Be wary of consultants and contractors who tell you this is how it should be done, and I learned this on the old VI3 course 6 years ago. It happens an awful lot in our industry. One of the things that you should get from your home lab is the ability to change the configuration very quickly to break those best practices, to see what would happen if you didn't follow the best practices, to see what would happen if the limitations would be removed, what would be capable. All the things you could never do in a production environment because you would breach your support. Yeah? The other thing I want to say about best practices is this. How often in our industry has that term, best practices, become a CYA attribute of the way vendors and customers interact with each other? What does CYA stand for? Yeah, cover your ass. That's what it stands for. Yeah. The number of times I've seen customers do things which have been quite clearly bonkers, crazy, stupid, and then they'll go, but we followed best practices. Yeah. Look, it says this is a best practice. And I say to them, you know, it doesn't say underneath that, now lift up the top of your cranium, take out your brain, and then close your cranium. The best practice doesn't say, you know, have a frontal lobe lobotomy. Yeah? You're supposed to engage with that best practice, look at it, and say, does it apply to my particular environment? Yeah? I must admit, as a former IT manager as well, I used to get the best practices joker played by the ISVs as well. I'd do something that didn't work, and then somebody would go through all this documentation that nobody could possibly read all of it and go, we've not followed this best practice, therefore it's not our problem. I wish both sides of this relationship could get out of the CYA model and interface and discuss in an intelligent human way that these best practices themselves evolve out of certain circumstances. They're not some holy grail. It's not holy writ, you know. It's not the Quran, it's not the Bible, you know, the indivisible word of God. These are things that are created by humans, and therefore they have all the flaws of humans as well. But keep on top of what the best practices are. They do change, yeah, and they change your design. So some lessons learned. I think I've touched on this already, so I don't really want to go into this particular slide in too much detail. I want to go a bit more specific. I want to tell you about some of the things that went wrong when I was learning vCloud Director. I'm still making mistakes to this day. So I have a VLAN environment. I created a VLAN 10 on my switch. On a port group, I set VLAN 10, and then I pointed my vCloud Director at that port group. And it said VLAN 10. And then I went, you know what, I don't really like VLAN 10. I wish that was actually VLAN 11 instead. So I went to the switch and made it 11. I went to the virtual switch and made it 11. And I did a refresh in vCloud Director, and it said 11. But actually, it was lying to me. It actually thought the VLAN was 10, still in the database. Yeah? So although everything seemed to be in a row, physical, virtual, cloud, all said 11, actually in the database, vCloud Director still thought it was 10. Yeah? It is a feature of the product. Yeah? And there's a KB article that explains how wonderful this feature is and how you might want to change this feature if you have a problem. Yeah, because what do you think happens if vCloud Director thinks the VLAN ID is 10, but actually the VLAN is something else? Do you think you get network communication, or do you think you get diddly squat? You get diddly squat, yeah? Solution to this problem, you can actually go into the database and fix it, or you can delete the network as it's referred to in vCloud Director, recreate it. The delete obviously destroys the reference in the database, and the create fixes the problem. Yeah? Not a particularly nice thing to have to do. So there's a bit of a message about that, which is, if you're going to do this in your home lab, yeah, think about the VLANs that you're going to use. Sit down with a piece of paper. Do you remember that piece of technology? And you know, think about how you're going to lay out your network, rather than doing it on the fly and going, oh, I think I'll make it something else today. Yeah, that's not how you usually do production environments, is it? Yeah, it's not like you go to your network teams. You go, you know, I asked for this VLAN ID. Well, I changed my mind. I want something else. You tend to make the request and you stick to it. Yeah, rather than constantly making a movable feast. Yeah. The other thing, watch out for your IP ranges. Right, okay, I have to spin this up quite quickly. In my lab environment, my core external network is on a 192.168.3. My organizational network's on 172, and my VApp network's on 10. It's all upside down, yeah? Because the external network is big, the organization network is smaller than it, in terms of the number of IP ranges you'll probably need, and a VApp network probably only contains 4 or 5 VMs used by a developer, yeah? So what I wish I'd had is 10 for my external network, 172 for my orgs, 192 for my VApp networks, as if they were branch offices, if you like. I know it's perhaps a bit old hat to think of Class A, Class B, and Class C addresses, but believe you and me, when you're typing in commands and you're looking at screen grabs, if your IP is all over the shop, it just looks stupid. Yeah. If you look at some of my articles on my blog, you can see these IP addresses. Yeah. And I constantly put apologies into the blog post. I'm sorry about this. Yeah. You know. Why did I start off with 192.163? Well, my home lab is connected to my Wi-Fi, domestic Wi-Fi. And most domestic Wi-Fi uses a 192 address of some description. So I thought, oh, well, I'll use that. One flat network with everything on it. Not very realistic if you're dealing with this sort of multi-tenant environment where everything is segmented. Yeah. So if that's what you've got in your home lab, maybe you need to think about VLANing, and maybe you need to think about re-IPing before you jump in with both feet to get something that feels a bit more realistic. IP ranges can be tricky to change, and that's another reason to get all this IP sorted out in your head. Even with a VApp network powered off, you'll see that the IP address for the default gateway for that VApp is grayed out. So it's not easy to change the default gateways once they've been set and configured on this particular system. You might think, as a sysadmin, I should be able to change everything I like in the environment. It is, after all, just software. But, you know, we don't tend to go off into the physical world changing the default gateway on our core infrastructure routers just because we feel like the IP address might be wrong, do we? Yeah. I personally think this should be editable, but when you edit it, before you click OK, it should ask, now type in a 4-digit number to confirm you're the right person to make this change. Please click OK that you accept that this change could disconnect thousands of virtual machines and tenants in your cloud. Yeah? So sometimes it's actually nice to not be able to make changes because it prevents you from doing something that could be very stupid. The man with the saw on the tree again. Yeah. Another tip, yeah, I'll keep these quick. When you power off and power on a VApp by default, it creates and destroys an edge gateway, a router, a NAT device on the fly. The assumption is if it's powered off, why waste resources with having an appliance you don't need? However, if you're inputting static routes to make communication work from one VApp to another, or you're using DNAT routes, a specific IP address to allow inbound connection, what you'll need to do is put this tick in the box to stop that from happening. Because the next time you power on the VApp, it might get a totally different IP address from the pool, and guess what? Your NAT routes and your static routes will be broken and not work ever again, yeah, until you edit them. Yeah. Establish a meaningful naming convention. Always makes me laugh, this. Every training course I've ever attended or been on has said, establish a meaning naming convention. Yeah? I once worked in a place where all the servers were named after the dwarves in Snow White. Yeah? There's a meaningful naming convention. Sleepy wasn't the most powerful server that we had in the cluster. But the main reason to do this is if you're doing ping tests and things like it, you can very easily see where the traffic is moving. So the first couple of letters of the prefix on these labels in the screen capture describe one of my orgs, Corp Overseas Investment Group, going to Corp HQ, and it shows me all the layers of it going through the VApp network, the organizational network, across the external network, down into the organization of another org, across the VApp network and then onto the endpoint. Yeah. Once you just have labels or just IP addresses, it's very difficult to troubleshoot where the comms are actually going. This guy here is a man sucking an egg. Yeah, you know that phrase, don't teach grandma how to suck eggs? So I realize that I'm saying something which should be obvious. But how often have you worked in production environments where naming conventions have just been not really thought through at all? Yeah. So I guess you like, this is me, CYA. This is Mike's best practice. Yeah. If you then have a bad naming convention, I can just, well, you know, I haven't followed best practices. Sorry. You know, your fault, not mine. OVFs, are they as open and portable as you imagine them? I got this error just a couple of weeks ago after taking one of my VMs on vSphere 5.1, vCloud Director 5.1, and trying to import it into a public cloud. What I didn't know was my particular chosen public cloud vendor was still using vSphere 4.1 and vCloud Director 1.5. The OVF had a hardware level 9, that their ESX host could never ever run. Okay, so watch out for moving virtual machines around in different flavors of our particular products, especially if you want to move a VM into the cloud. Yeah, so this is where you set it on a provider VDC. Your lab, what are you going to do? I know you don't want a 42U rack, you don't want that expense. I think you've got a couple of options. You could create something like a vTardis kind of setup, which you might have heard of. One big box with a lot of memory. If you're interested in doing that, please attend the Auto Lab session earlier today, which shows how you can build a very big vSphere environment full of nested ESX hosts, ESX installed inside a virtual machine. If you don't want to go that far, you could actually use VMware Workstation and Fusion nowadays to run ESX and have a mini lab that way. Another idea is, why can't we have our home labs in the cloud? Yeah, vSphere running inside vSphere, but not on your desk or not on the Colo, but elsewhere. I call this Inception, you know, after the movie, where there's a dream, inside a dream, inside a dream, and the stars in that particular show have to have some sort of totem to remind them that it's just a dream, that it's not real. Yeah, I picked a silver foil unicorn from Blade Runner. Yeah, so when I was in my vSphere level in vCloud, which is also running vSphere, which is also running vCloud Director, I could hold onto the tin foil and go, it's not real. It's all just virtual. Yeah, I'm in a dream. Yeah. But what I'm talking about is different levels of abstraction. So the VINCEPTION level 0 is where your physical hosts are. The next level up is vSphere running in a VApp inside that physical environment. And the next level beyond that is VApps running actually on it. This is the basis of what we call the hardware, the hands-on labs. That's how the hands-on labs work at VMworld. It's how our vCell environment that our SEs use to do demonstrations also use it. But wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to buy PCs and didn't have to have a Colo, but you could have a whole lab environment just in the cloud? Yeah. Early stages of this, and I'm working with some of our vCloud providers to see whether we can get a proof of concept of this actually up and running. Yeah. My theory is if they could make money out of this, or if it would be an opportunity to then sell you other services, then maybe they would be interested in doing this for the community. So if you've been using iLAN, for example, for your personal lab, and then your boss says to you, we should put some workloads in the cloud, maybe it would be iLAN that you first spoke to. There's got to be something in it for them to do this. Yeah? So this is ESX1, ESX2 in New Jersey with a virtual center, and that's actually a VApp running on my physical environment. Yeah? When you log into it, it looks as any other vSphere environment, all nested. Why? Well, you know, I don't want to pay the Colo costs, so I don't want to have PCs under my desk. I don't know what the future really brings for my lab environment. I'm supposed to be leaving the UK later this year and going to California, and I don't intend to have 42U worth of equipment shipped over to Palo Alto. That would be stupid. So, you know, I don't really know where I'm going in this particular journey of the lab, but I'm still using it to this day. Thank you for listening to my experiences and my little journey. If you want to follow me, the blog is mikelaverick.com. If you want to tweet me, it's at Mike_Laverick. I also run a podcast where we sort of discuss these things with other people in the community. But I've massively overrun, and it's time for this Brit to get off the stage. Thank you very much. Thank you.